Optimum.com/business. Leadership support for WNYC comes from the Jerome L. Green Foundation, a proud supporter of New York City's major cultural institutions, providing scholarships in the arts, education, and medicine.
I'm Marco Werman. You're with The World. Could there at last be peace in Yemen? Today, Saudi Arabia announced that it was seeking to end Yemen's 6-year civil war. The Saudis have supported Yemen's government in its conflict with Houthi rebels. The toll of that war has been grim. It's estimated that more than 100,000 people have been killed and around 4 million people displaced. Abu Bakr al-Shamahi has been following this. He's a researcher with the Sana Center for Strategic Studies and is from Raleigh, North Carolina. How significant is this latest development, Abu Bakr? Does it mark an actual change of policy for Saudi Arabia and Yemen?
Well, this isn't the first time that the Saudis have announced a ceasefire plan. Almost this time last year, I think, with the start of the coronavirus pandemic spreading around the region, they announced a ceasefire plan then. Nothing really happened at the time. Now, this time, the Saudis do appear to be attempting to make a big deal out of this, so to speak. What they're saying is if the Houthis agree on the other side, and the Yemeni government agree as well, that there will be, an end to the war in the country, a ceasefire. The Sana'a airport, which is the main airport in the country, controlled by the Houthis, will be open. A number of other things as well. So all very good things, but you have to remember that this comes on the 6th anniversary of the beginning of the Saudi intervention in Yemen. Saudi normally gets a lot of heat at that time in the international arena from the international press, and they'll be attempting to make out, especially to the new US administration, that they are willing to make peace with the other side. Now, what remains to be seen is what the response from the other side is going to be. We've already heard from spokesmen from the Houthis, for example, saying that this is nothing new, that this proposal brings nothing new. And so based on that, it's still really early days, and we're going to have to see whether this will actually lead to an end to even this latest bout of fighting in the country.
So one thing you just said, the new U.S. administration, it is different. What does it mean that this announcement from Saudi Arabia came after the U.S. announced that it was no longer supporting Saudi's offensive operations in the war?
The U.S. Biden administration knows that it can't really force the Saudis to stop, but just by symbolically almost ending support for Saudi offensive operations in Yemen, Biden has really indicated that he wants some kind of change from the Saudi side. Now, in terms of this proposal, I think, yes, it is important that it's come after the beginning of the new U.S. administration, but like I say, I think it might be more of an attempt to get support from the Biden administration and show that, yes, we are doing something without that actually necessarily translating to real action on the ground.
So what do you think this actually means for the war on the ground? How likely is fighting to continue after this announcement?
I think for now, fighting will continue. The proposal is a proposal. It's not an actual change to the Saudis' actions on the ground or the other forces in the conflict. The Saudis are saying themselves, nothing changes until we get it right from all sides on this.
And as we consider the Yemeni people, how immediately do you think this news will lead to an easing of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen?
Now, unfortunately, all sides are very realistic about this, almost realist, and they all see that these humanitarian issues are directly related to political and military issues. But all of that just means, really, that, as you said, on the ground, civilians are the ones who are suffering. It's almost around 3/4 of the country, the Yemeni population, who are in need of aid. And that situation is only getting worse.
Abu Bakr al-Shamahi is a researcher with the Sana Center for Strategic Studies, speaking with us from Raleigh, North Carolina, about the news from Saudi Arabia. The kingdom is looking to establish a ceasefire in the Yemen war. Abu Bakr, thank you.
Thank you.
Once again in Israel, it's off to the races.
מדינת ישראל שוב תלך לבחירות בפעם הרביעית בתוך פחות משנתיים.
Tomorrow, Israelis go to the polls, the 4th national election in Israel in just 2 years. So what is different this time around? The World's Ariel Osseran is on the line from Tel Aviv. Hey, Ariel.
Hey, Marco.
So, Ariel, what is the big political story here ahead of the vote Tuesday?
So the big political story here is that Israelis are tired. I mean, they voted times in the past 2 years, and they have to go to the ballots again. You have Israel's longest-sitting prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He wants to be reelected again, and this is pretty much a contest between him, his supporters, and those who would finally like to see him end his tenure as prime minister and leave office. I will say, though, that we're so used to continuous rounds of election that more than previous rounds, Israelis are now pretty much gearing up for the fifth round.
Wow.
The majority of Israelis think that this election won't bring a decisive outcome.
All right, we're not there yet. We're still on election number 4, and it's still all about Benjamin Netanyahu. Remind us why there is this fourth election in 2 years.
So, first of all, it's important to understand how elections work here. And, Israelis, when they go to vote, they don't pick a certain politician. Instead, they vote for a party. Israelis have become more polarized in recent years, so there isn't one party or one leader that can win an outright majority. It's about building a coalition, partnerships of parties of at least 61 seats.
61.
Yeah, 61 out of 120. And recent polls show that neither big political bloc, either on the right or on the left, has that majority. I asked Professor Tamar Herman about this. She teaches political science at the Open University of Israel.
In a way, the fact that none of the two political blocs is able to get a clear-cut majority is a reflection of the fact that the Israeli public is divided almost in the middle.
Herman says that this is actually dangerous for Israel's democratic stability. Political division has led to this exhausting stalemate, she says, and it's really hurt the country, especially during this pandemic.
So if we're looking for a way out of this division, these main blocs you're talking about, right and left, is that the same as supporters of Netanyahu versus his political opponents, or is it even more complex than that?
Well, the simple answer is yes and no. The complex answer is that Netanyahu does hope to form a right-wing coalition headed by his conservative Likud party, and with parties he refers to as his natural allies. These are the ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionist parties. But this time he doesn't really have one main contender. The opposite bloc isn't united ideologically, and they're simply hoping to defeat Netanyahu. But they're having a really difficult time joining forces and cooperating against him coherently. As you pointed out, though, many Israelis do see this as a referendum over Netanyahu's continued reign. You're either pro-Bibi, that's Netanyahu's nickname, or anti-Bibi. But it's even more than that. Here's Professor Herman again.
The very external layer is for or against Netanyahu, but basically Netanyahu stands for something, and this something is a Jewish state with more concern about its Jewishness rather than its democratic nature.
Herman goes on to point out that until recently, the political divide in Israel used to be mainly around the conflict with the Palestinians. Today, it's actually more similar to the divide between Democrats and Republicans in the U.S.
The world's Ariel Osaran speaking from Tel Aviv about Israel's fourth national election in 2 years. That's coming up tomorrow. Ariel, thanks very much.
Thanks, Marco.
More stories from around the globe still ahead. You're listening to The World.
Support for WNYC comes from Drexel University. Drexel's academic model is designed to prepare visionary leaders to address the challenges of a changing world. More at drexel.edu/ambition. Can't wait.
For more than 95 years, New Yorkers have been listening to WNYC for reliable news and conversation. Now there's another way to do it. Just ask your smart speaker to play WNYC. Learn how at WNYC.org/smartspeaker.
In El Salvador, an environmental victory against foreign mining companies. A common threat united Salvadoran conservatives and progressives.
People were probably shooting at each other a decade earlier.
Also ahead, a hard pandemic year for Brazilians. We look back and ahead with Brazil's fight against COVID. Coming up here on The World.
Support for The World comes from Progressive Insurance, offering its Home Quote Explorer, so shoppers can evaluate options in one place when buying home insurance. Custom quotes and rates available online. Learn more at progressive.com.
co-production of GBH Boston and PRX. Safe and 79% effective. That is the word from AstraZeneca about the U.S. study of its COVID-19 vaccine. This is the vaccine that a lot of the world will and is already relying upon to protect people from COVID, especially poorer countries in the UN's COVAX program. But AstraZeneca's had a rough ride with European regulators approving, then pausing, then restarting the vaccine. The long-awaited U.S. data was hoped to boost public confidence. Dr. Miguel Nicolelis has been following these developments closely. He joins us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Doctor, more than 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine arrived in Sao Paulo yesterday. That's Brazil's first shipment from the COVAX program. How does it feel to have these vaccine doses ready to distribute right now?
Well, in Brazil, the acceptance of the vaccine has been pretty high. So people here are really eager to get vaccinated. So the news that this shipment had finally arrived in Brazil was very good news for most Brazilians and for most of the Brazilian press.
How much confidence do Brazilians have in the AstraZeneca vaccine, given kind of some of the doubts that were cast on it over the past few weeks?
Well, those doubts never materialized in Brazil. Brazil has a very stingy regulatory agency, Anvisa, that studied the data that AstraZeneca submitted to the regulators for several weeks, and he concluded that the vaccine was safe. And also, when the news from Europe came, Anvisa again supported the AstraZeneca vaccine, saying that the data from Europe showed that the thrombotic episodes were statistically not above what you see in a controlled population. So far in Brazil, the acceptance of the population has been pretty high.
So how is Brazil doing overall today, Monday the 22nd of March, with COVID? And what kind of a difference does this arrival of AstraZeneca vaccines make, do you think?
Well, Brazil is doing very poorly. We're in a very dramatic situation right now. I just saw the numbers from last week was the most deadly week in Brazil since the beginning of the pandemic, and we had more deaths that week than twice the number of deaths in the U.S. So it's a very dramatic and critical situation. And Brazil is vaccinating just about 300,000 people a day, which is 7 to 10 times less than it should be doing right now. The expectation was 2 to 3 million doses a day, pretty close to what the U.S. is doing, because Brazil has the infrastructure and is used to vaccinate that many people a day in previous campaigns. So the country is doing very poorly, but the arrival of the shipment was extremely well received, because now Brazil needs tens of millions of doses to be able to vaccinate a large percentage of the population as soon as possible, because there is a tremendous problem given that the federal government is not imposing a national lockdown, is not contributing to the fight to COVID like most of us would like to see.
Dr. Nicolelis, we know that President Jair Bolsonaro is a COVID denier. I mean, that's going to have some impact on Brazil's current disastrous situation. But you also say people across Brazil have accepted the AstraZeneca vaccine. So when it comes to COVID,